Wildlife photographer Jake Carter sought the pristine solitude of the Rocky Mountains to capture a legend, the elusive wolverine. He rented a remote cabin, a speck of civilization in a vast, untamed wilderness, believing the silence was his ally. He was an expert, accustomed to the wild's patient rhythms. But this basin had its own rhythm, an ancient territorial consciousness that saw through the eyes of every creature in the forest. Jake came seeking a single predator, only to discover the entire ecosystem had become one, and he was the prey. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The tires of Jake's Forerunner crunched over the gravel of what could barely be called a road, the final rugged artery into the heart of the Bighorn Basin. For the last hour, the only signs of humanity had been the occasional moss-covered fence post, skeletal remains of a long-abandoned ranch. Now, there was only the dense, cathedral-like forest of lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce, their colossal forms pressing in on either side. When the cabin finally appeared in a clearing, it was exactly as the rental listing had promised, a single, sturdy structure of dark-hewn logs with a metal roof, looking both defiant and utterly dwarfed by the jagged, snow-dusted peaks that served as its backdrop. This was it, the perfect isolation. Jake killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was profound. It wasn't just quiet, it was a physical presence, a weight of stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. He stepped out of the truck, breathing in the crisp, cool air, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. This was his church. For the next week, this basin would be his studio. His mission? To achieve what few photographers had managed, to capture a clear, definitive image of Gulo Gulo, the wolverine, a creature so fierce and famously elusive it was more myth than mammal in these parts. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of professional bliss. He unpacked his gear with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon laying out his instruments. 2 Pelican cases held his primary cameras and an arsenal of lenses. Another contained the guts of his operation, a half-dozen high-tech camera traps, each a self-contained unit with a motion sensor, infrared flash, and high-resolution camera. He hummed to himself as he mounted the first one on a thick pine tree overlooking a game trail, angling it perfectly. He set up another near a rocky outcrop and a third by the stream that cut through the meadow in front of the cabin. His gear was his extension into the wilderness, silent sentinels that would watch when he could not. Inside, the cabin was rustic but solid. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a comfortable-looking armchair parked beside it. A simple kitchenette, a bed in a loft, and a large picture window overlooking the clearing. Perfect. He felt the familiar thrill of the hunt, the deep satisfaction of being alone and self-reliant in a place of immense power and beauty. The first oddity occurred on the evening of the second day. As dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Jake was cleaning a lens by the picture window. A mature doe and 2 yearlings stepped delicately from the tree line at the far side of the clearing. He froze, as any wildlife photographer would, admiring their grace. But they didn't forage. They didn't flick their ears nervously or test the air for his scent. They simply stopped, all 3 heads lifting in unison, and stared directly at the cabin. It wasn't a glance. Their bodies were perfectly still, their dark, liquid eyes fixed on his window. Minutes passed. Jake remained motionless, a knot of mild confusion tightening in his stomach. This was unusual. Deer, especially in remote areas, were typically skittish, ghosts that melted into the foliage at the slightest hint of a human. These 3 were like statues. Finally, as if following a silent command, the doe turned her head and led the yearlings back into the forest, vanishing as silently as they had appeared. Jake exhaled, a small laugh escaping his lips. "Guess they haven't seen a cabin dweller in a while," he muttered. He was an expert, a man who understood animal behavior. He dismissed it as a curiosity, a testament to the basin's isolation. The next morning, it was the birds. A flock of Steller's jays, usually chaotic and raucous, gathered in the massive pine tree nearest the cabin. Instead of squabbling and flitting between branches, they sat in a dense, silent cluster on the boughs facing the cabin. When Jake stepped onto the porch with his morning coffee, the entire flock took flight, not scattering, but circling directly over the cabin roof in 3 perfect coordinated loops before dispersing into the forest. It was strangely geometric, almost deliberate. He felt a prickle of unease, but pushed it down with logic. A predator, maybe a hawk, was nearby, causing the unusual flocking behavior. The deer were simply unused to his presence. There was a rational explanation for everything. He was a man of science and observation, not fantasy. He was here to document the natural order, and while this was atypical, it was still, for now, within the realm of the natural. He was intrigued, not yet fearful, as he picked up his pack to check the first of his camera traps. The air was still and cool as Jake hiked the half-mile to his first camera trap. The forest floor was a soft carpet of pine needles, muffling his footsteps. He felt the familiar sense of peace that came with being immersed in the wild. The odd behavior of the last 2 days already receding in his mind, filed away as interesting data points. He knelt by the game trail, pleased to see the ground was disturbed with fresh tracks. He unlatched the weatherproof casing of the camera trap, ready to swap out the SD card. That's when he felt it, the unmistakable primal feeling of being watched. He slowly raised his head. Standing not 40 feet away, partially obscured by the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, was a magnificent bull elk. It was a royal, a giant of its species, with a rack of antlers so wide and heavy it seemed impossible it could navigate the dense woods. It should have bolted. His scent was all over this area. Yet it stood its ground, its massive head turned directly toward him. And its eyes. Jake had looked into the eyes of countless wild animals. He'd seen fear, aggression, curiosity, and indifference. He had never seen this. The elk's gaze was not that of a simple beast. It was fixed on him with an unnerving, focused intelligence. There was no fear. There was no threat display, no flared nostrils or lowered antlers. There was only a calm, steady, evaluative scrutiny. It felt ancient. For a long, heart-stopping moment, Jake felt like an intruder being assessed, his purpose and presence being weighed by a power he couldn't comprehend. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them. The elk was the gatekeeper, and Jake had just been asked for his credentials. After what felt like an eternity, the great animal blinked once, slowly, then turned its head with a regal grace and moved silently into the trees, its departure leaving a void in the atmosphere. Jake remained kneeling, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence it left behind was more unnerving than its presence had been. He fumbled with the SD card, his hands trembling slightly. Back at the cabin that night, with a fire crackling in the hearth against the deep chill of the mountain evening, he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey and plugged the first SD card into his laptop. He needed the sterile comfort of technology, the objective eye of his camera, to dispel the deeply unsettling feeling from the encounter with the elk. The first few clips were normal, a raccoon sniffing curiously at the lens, a fleeting glimpse of a pine marten. Then the strange clips began. The first was time-stamped at 2:17 a.m. A red fox, its fur sharp and clear in the infrared light, walked directly to the center of the frame. It didn't pass through. It stopped, lifted its head, and stared directly into the lens. Its eyes, glowing a ghostly white, were unblinking. It stood there for a full 3 minutes before turning and trotting away. Jake leaned closer to the screen. An hour later, a coyote appeared and did the exact same thing. It approached, stopped at the same spot, and stared. Its posture was identical, a fixed, unwavering gaze. He scrubbed through the footage. It was a parade of unnatural stillness. 2 does, side by side, staring. A badger low to the ground, its snout pointed at the lens. Clip after clip of different species, animals that were often rivals or predator and prey, approaching the same spot one by one to perform the same silent, eerie ritual. They were like soldiers reporting for duty, their eyes glowing in the darkness, all pointed at the invisible observer, his camera. The footage from the other cameras told the same impossible story. Different animals, different locations, same unnerving behavior. This wasn't natural. This wasn't a disease. This felt like coordination. His hands shook as he powered up the satellite phone. It took several tries to get a signal, the connection crackling with static. Finally, a voice came through. "Vance, Park Service." "Sarah, it's Jake Carter, up at the Bighorn Basin cabin." "Jake, how's the hermit life? See your ghost cat yet?" Her voice was warm and professional. "Something else," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Something is wrong with the wildlife up here. I'm seeing synchronized behavior. Animals of different species, all just staring at the cabin, at me, at my cameras, for minutes at a time. It's like they're observing me." He described the stag, the footage, the sheer unnaturalness of it all. There was a pause on the other end. "That is highly atypical," Sarah admitted, her casual tone shifting to one of scientific curiosity. "Could be a neurological issue. We've seen chronic wasting disease cause strange behavior in deer and elk, but not across species like that, and never coordinated observation. Maybe a localized environmental toxin, a type of mushroom or lichen they're all ingesting?" Her explanations were logical, scientific. They were the same explanations Jake had tried to give himself, but they felt hollow. They didn't account for the feeling he'd had under the elk's gaze, the chilling sense of a unified, intelligent intent behind the glowing eyes on his laptop screen. "I don't think it's a toxin," Jake said, his voice dropping. "It feels like I'm being watched, scrutinized." "Isolation can play tricks on your mind, Jake," Sarah said gently. "Keep your logs detailed, document everything. If it continues, we'll look into it. For now, just be safe." The call ended, leaving Jake in a silence that was now filled with the phantom glow of 1,000 staring eyes. Science had no answer, and as he looked out the dark picture window into the vast black wilderness, he felt for the first time not alone, but terrifyingly, comprehensively. The third day bled into the fourth, and the phenomenon shifted from a series of unsettling incidents into a constant, oppressive state of being. The observation was no longer sporadic, it was permanent. From the moment the sun rose to the moment it sank behind the peaks, Jake could look out his window at any given time and see something at the edge of the clearing, watching. It was a silent, coordinated changing of the guard. For an hour, it might be a coyote, sitting calmly on its haunches at the eastern tree line, its head cocked. It made no sound. It didn't pace or sniff the air. It just watched the cabin. Then, as if its shift was over, it would rise, turn, and melt into the forest, and within minutes, a pair of elk would emerge from the west to take its place. Later, a murder of crows would settle into the branches of a dead aspen, a dozen pairs of black, beady eyes all trained on the cabin. They didn't caw or squabble, they just sat, a silent jury. The psychological toll was immediate and corrosive. Jake, a man who had once found solace in the vastness of the wilderness, now felt trapped by it. The beautiful, panoramic landscape had transformed into a panopticon, an all-seeing prison, where every tree, every rock could be hiding a pair of eyes. The feeling of being seen was a physical weight on his shoulders. He started keeping the curtains drawn, even during the day, living in a self-imposed twilight. At night, he'd find himself standing in the dark, peering through a tiny crack in the blinds, his heart seizing when he'd see the faint, twin glow of infrared eyes staring back from the darkness. Sleep became a luxury. When he did drift off, his dreams were filled with the image of the elk's intelligent, assessing gaze. He felt a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that frayed his nerves raw. He was a wildlife photographer who had become terrified of wildlife. The irony was a bitter pill. On the fifth night, sleep was impossible. The silence outside was too heavy, too expectant. To distract himself, Jake pulled a book from his bag, a collection of local histories and folklore he'd picked up at a gas station on the way in. He read about mining booms, legendary storms, and early settlers. And then he found it. A short, chilling chapter titled The Lost Prospector of Bighorn Basin. It told the story of a man named Silas Thorne, a prospector who had ventured into this very basin in the 1890s searching for gold and had never come out. They called him Old Man Hemlock because his abandoned camp was found near a grove of ancient hemlock trees. A search party had found his tent, his tools, and his journal, but Silas himself had vanished without a trace. The journal was dismissed by the authorities of the time as the paranoid ramblings of a man driven mad by isolation. Jake read the transcribed excerpts, and a glacial coldness spread through his chest, far colder than the mountain air outside. October 12th. The quiet here is wrong. The animals do not act as God intended. They watch me, all of them. I saw a fox and a snowshoe hare taking water from the same stream, side by side, and both turned to look at me as one. Their fear of each other is gone. There is only me. October 19th. It is a single mind. I am certain of it now. A spirit in the mountain, a devil in the trees. It sees through 1,000 eyes. The squirrels are its spies, and the elk its sentinels. I move my camp, and it knows. I hide my trail, and it follows. It does not sleep, it only watches. October 25th. The watching is not enough for it anymore. I feel it pressing in. It wants me gone. The wind whispers my name. I cannot bear the weight of its unblinking gaze. It is everywhere. I am not alone. I am trapped inside its eye. The final entry was a barely legible scrawl. It is the forest, the whole damn forest. Jake dropped the book as if it were burning. The words echoed his own thoughts with terrifying precision. The squirrels are its spies, and the elk its sentinels. Watched him through 1,000 eyes. This wasn't a new phenomenon. It wasn't a toxin or a disease. He was experiencing the exact same thing that had driven a man to madness or death over a century ago. The cold dread that had been a whisper in the back of his mind was now a deafening scream. He was not going crazy. The watcher was real, and it had been here, in this basin, for a very, very long time. The morning of the 6th day brought a new and more profound level of terror. Jake awoke not to a sound, but to the absolute absence of it. He lay in his loft bed, his ears straining, and realized what was wrong. The forest, which was always a symphony of subtle sound, the gentle sigh of wind through the pines, the distant chatter of a squirrel, the hum of insects, the chirping of dawn birds, had fallen completely silent. It was not peace. It was a suffocating, unnatural vacuum. A heavy, pregnant silence, like the held breath of a predator just before it strikes. He crept to the window and peered out. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the clearing. A magpie sat on a fence post, its beak closed. A chipmunk was frozen on a rock, its body rigid. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting. The anticipation was a physical pressure, making the air in the cabin feel thick and hard to breathe. He spent the morning in a state of high alert, every nerve screaming. The silence stretched for hours, a torment of suspense. Then, just after noon, the first sound came. It was a single, sharp bird call, a piercing, two-note cry that erupted from the dense forest to the north of the cabin. The sound was so sudden and isolated in the oppressive silence that it made Jake jump. He stared towards the north, his heart pounding. Seconds later, an identical call answered from the south, a perfect echo. Then, a sharp staccato coyote yip from the east. It was immediately answered by another identical yip from the west. A cold sweat broke out on Jake's forehead. This wasn't animal communication. He had spent his life listening to the sounds of the wild. This was different. This was signaling. The calls were too precise, too uniform, too perfectly spaced. It was a form of triangulation, and the cabin, he, was the exact center point. They were pinpointing his location. The sounds continued sporadically throughout the afternoon. A call from the northwest, answered from the southeast. The slap of a beaver's tail on the stream, answered by the rattling sound of a woodpecker drumming against a hollow tree. Each sound was a marker, a node in a vast, invisible network of perception. The forest was talking to itself, and he was the subject of conversation. Panic began to set in, a frantic, clawing thong in his chest. He scrambled for the satellite phone, his hands clumsy. He had to tell Sarah, he had to make someone believe him. He needed the voice of reason, even if it was miles away. After several agonizing attempts, the connection sputtered to life. "Sarah, it's Jake." His voice was strained, cracking with panic. "Jake, you sound terrible. What's going on?" Her voice was tight with concern. The scientific curiosity was gone, replaced by genuine worry. "The sounds, Sarah, you have to hear this." He held the phone up, praying something would happen. As if on cue, the two-note bird call cried out from the north, sharp and clear. Jake held his breath. A moment later, the southern call answered, the phone just sensitive enough to pick it up. "Did you hear that?" he whispered desperately. There was a long pause on the other end. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was low and serious. "Yes, I heard it. Jake, that's not a known call and response pattern. Not for any species I know of. The timing, it's too deliberate. It's triangulating, Sarah. It's all around me." "Jake," she said, her tone urgent, "I want you to listen to me. I don't know what's happening up there, but my gut tells me it's not safe. Forget the wolverine, forget the pictures. I think you should consider cutting your trip short. Pack up and get out, now." Her words, meant to be a lifeline, were instead a confirmation of his terror. The voice of science was telling him to run. The satellite phone crackled and the line went dead. He tried to redial, but there was no signal. As he lowered the phone, he heard a new sound from just outside the cabin, a persistent, rhythmic thump, thump, thumping against the wooden wall. It was the sound of a woodpecker hammering with an unceasing, mechanical rhythm right beside the window, like a slow, deliberate knock on his door. Trapped in the unnerving silence between the triangulating calls, Jake's mind raced, desperately trying to connect the impossible dots. He paced the small cabin, his boots thudding on the wooden floor, the book about Old Man Hemlock lying open on the table. Hemlock's words, "The squirrels are its spies and the elk its sentinels," collided with Sarah's alarmed reaction and his own terrifying experiences. And in a moment of dreadful clarity, a theory began to form, a theory so monstrous it made the hairs on his arms stand up. There was a single consciousness in this basin. It wasn't a monster of flesh and blood. It was something older, more elemental, a genius loci, a nature spirit, a non-corporeal entity intrinsically tied to the land itself, the rocks, the trees, the water. He started calling it the host, for it was the master of this domain, and the animals were its puppets. It was largely immobile, a consciousness rooted to this specific mountain basin, but its reach was absolute within its territory. It could neurally hijack the local fauna, seeing through their eyes, hearing through their ears, and, as he was beginning to fear, acting through their bodies. It didn't possess them in a demonic sense, it simply overrode their base instincts with its own unified ancient will. His arrival, a modern human with strange, gleaming technology, a foreign scent, and a disruptive presence, had been registered not by one animal, but by the entire ecosystem at once. His intrusion into its pristine, silent territory was an anomaly, a curiosity that had now escalated into a perceived threat that needed to be investigated, contained, and neutralized. He had to test it. He had to know if he was truly insane or if his horrifying theory was correct. With his heart pounding, he devised a simple experiment. He grabbed one of his spare camera traps, a thing of plastic and metal that reeked of his human scent. He unbolted the cabin door, stepped out into the oppressive silence, and quickly walked 20 yards to a lone birch tree at the edge of the clearing. He strapped the camera to its trunk in a location with no game trails, no logical reason for any animal to visit. Then he retreated back inside, locking the door behind him. He watched through the window. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The forest remained unnaturally still. Then, a Steller's jay flew from the deep woods and landed on a branch directly above the new camera. It was soon joined by another, then 3 more. Within minutes, a silent flock of over a dozen jays were perched on the branches around the camera, all looking down at the strange object he had placed there. They hadn't seen him place it, they had simply known it was there. The host had directed its eyes to the new intrusion. A wave of nausea washed over him. He tried a second test. He took a deep breath and clapped his hands together, a single sharp report that shattered the silence. In the same instant, through the window, he saw everything flinch. The jays in the birch tree, a deer at the far end of the clearing, even a chipmunk on the porch railing he hadn't noticed before. They all reacted in perfect synchronized unison, a single collective spasm running through the forest. He stumbled back from the window, gasping for air. He was not being watched by animals. He was being watched by the forest itself. With this confirmation, the entity's behavior shifted from passive observation to subtle, menacing action. The sabotage began. That night, a squirrel took up residence on the metal roof directly above his loft bed. It didn't scurry or chatter. It methodically, relentlessly dropped pine cones onto the roof. Plink, plunk, plink. The sound was maddening, a form of water torture designed to deny him sleep. The next morning, he discovered the path to the stream was flooded. A beaver, working with unnatural speed, had constructed a new, small dam overnight, turning the low-lying ground into a muddy bog. It was a deniable, natural action, but its placement was too perfect, too inconvenient. Later that day, the woodpecker returned. It ignored the vast expanse of trees and began insistently hammering on the cabin wall directly behind the headboard of his bed. The sound was a rhythmic, drilling intrusion into his sanctuary, each peck a deliberate act of psychological warfare. The host was no longer just watching. It was beginning to press in, using its hands to dismantle his sanity. The thin veil of deniability was torn away on the 7th day. The host's actions escalated from subtle harassment to overt aggression. The siege had begun. Jake knew his time was running out. His supplies were finite, but his sanity was fraying even faster. He decided to make a break for it. He packed a go bag with his remaining food, water, the satellite phone, and the SD cards containing the horrifying footage. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, not for hunting, but for a defense he prayed he wouldn't need, and unlatched the cabin door. He stepped onto the porch and froze. Blocking the path leading out of the clearing, the only path his truck could take, was a herd of elk. Not grazing, not passing through. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of muscle and antler, their heads all turned towards him, their collective gaze flat and implacable. There were at least 20 of them, silent and still as the mountains behind them. It was a clear, unambiguous message: you are not leaving. Defeated, he retreated back inside, the heavy thud of the bolt sounding like a cell door slamming shut. He was a prisoner. The cabin, once his refuge, was now his cage. He tried the satellite phone again, his last hope for outside contact. It was dead. He checked the exterior cable where it snaked up to the small roof-mounted dish. The thick, weatherproof cord had been chewed clean through, the cuts too neat and powerful for a squirrel or a raccoon. He imagined the powerful jaws of a coyote or a bear, directed with intelligent purpose. The unseen watcher was no longer just watching. It was containing him, cutting him off from the world, tightening its grip. As dusk fell, the coyotes came. They didn't howl or yip. They emerged from the tree line like smoke, a dozen or more, forming a wide, loose circle around the cabin. They sat just beyond the reach of the single weak porch light, their eyes glowing in the deepening gloom. A ring of silent, patient predators. Jake spent the night pacing, the rifle clutched in his hands, his eyes darting between the windows. He found large, deep scratch marks gouged into the heavy oak of the door, far too high for a coyote. A bear? Or the elk, using their antlers? He didn't know which was worse. The final warning came just before midnight. The coyotes suddenly, silently stood and melted back into the woods. The clearing was empty. The silence returned, now more menacing than ever. And then, a single animal walked calmly into the center of the meadow. It was a mountain lion. A huge, muscular male, the very apex predator he might have come here to photograph in another lifetime. It moved with a liquid grace, its paws making no sound on the grass. It didn't stalk or crouch. It walked to the center of the clearing, sat down like a house cat, and stared directly at Jake through the large picture window. Its golden eyes were ancient and intelligent, holding the same terrifying, evaluative light as the bull elk. Jake stood frozen, mesmerized by its terrible beauty and power. This was it, the final messenger. The lion opened its mouth, and Jake braced for a roar that would shake the cabin. But no roar came. Instead, a chilling, impossible chorus of sounds issued from its throat. The piercing two-note bird call, the sharp yip of the coyote, the sound of the wind through the pines, and the rhythmic drumming of the woodpecker. It was a perfect, terrifying mimicry of the forest's voice, a collage of the signals the host had been using all week. It was the ultimate statement of ownership. All these voices are mine. This body is mine, and you are mine to do with as I please. The mountain lion closed its mouth, stood, and with one last lingering look, vanished into the night. The warning was delivered. There would not be another. The mountain lion's ghastly chorus broke something inside Jake. The slow-burning dread ignited into raw animal terror. He knew with absolute certainty that he was marked for death. The host would not kill him quickly. It would starve him out, drive him mad, or eventually send one of its larger puppets to batter down his door. He was trapped inside an all-seeing eye. He collapsed into the armchair, his mind racing, searching for an escape, a flaw in the enemy's design. And then it hit him. Its strength was its sight, its 1,000 pairs of eyes, its omnipresent collective vision, but that was also its weakness. It was a passive observer that relied on external senses. It could only see what its animal hosts could see. If he could blind those eyes, even temporarily, he might be able to create a blind spot, a gap in its perception large enough to slip through. His plan was desperate, insane, and dangerous. He had to start a fire. Not a signal fire, and not to burn the forest down, but to create a massive, impenetrable screen of smoke. A thick, acrid cloud that would envelop the cabin, blinding the watchers in the tree line, and, he hoped, confusing the collective consciousness that bound them. Panic gave way to purpose. He began to prepare. He tore apart a wooden crate that had held supplies, creating a pile of kindling. He chopped at a spare chair with his hatchet, adding the splintered legs to the pile. He gathered every flammable thing he could find: paper, old rags, the cooking oil from the kitchen. He worked with frantic speed, his every movement feeling like it was being scrutinized by the silent forest. And the forest knew. As he dragged his makeshift pyre onto the porch, the wilderness erupted. The unnatural silence was shattered by a deafening, chaotic frenzy. It was a full-scale assault by nature itself. A herd of deer charged the clearing, not to attack, but to stampede back and forth, their hooves churning the earth. Birds, no longer content to watch, began dive-bombing the cabin, thudding against the windows and roof like a hail of feathered stones. A cacophony of roars, screeches, howls, and growls rose from the tree line, every animal in the basin adding its voice to a terrifying war cry. The climax was Jake alone on the porch, a man against an entire ecosystem. A large black bear broke from the trees, roaring as it charged the clearing, only to be cut off by the frantic stampeding deer. Coyotes darted in and out of the chaos, snapping at the air. Jake fumbled with his lighter, his hands shaking violently, the wind from the bird's wings whipping at his face. He poured the cooking oil and the last of his lank fuel onto the pile. The noise was a physical blow, a sonic weapon designed to break his will. He shielded the lighter with his body, the tiny flame flickering, threatening to die. The roar of the bear grew closer. A crow swooped low, its claws raking his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling, but held on to the lighter. He thrust it into the oil-soaked rags. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a great whoosh, the pyre erupted in a column of greasy orange flame. Thick, black, acrid smoke billowed out instantly, pouring from the porch in a dense, opaque cloud. The wind, which had been still for days, seemed to shift, helping him, pushing the smoke out across the clearing toward the tree line. Jake scrambled back as the smoke screen grew, a rolling, blinding wall of gray and black that completely enveloped the cabin. The effect was instantaneous. The moment the cabin vanished from view, the animal assault stopped, the noise ceased. The unified chaos dissolved back into individual, confused creatures. The host, its 1,000 eyes blinded by the smoke, had lost its focus. Its connection was severed. He had found the blind spot. The silence that followed the fire's roar was as profound and unnerving as the one that had preceded it. Under the cover of the thick, churning smoke, Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his go-bag, stuffed with his essential gear, the incriminating SD cards, and the audio recordings from the sat phone, and burst out of the cabin's back door. He didn't look back. He plunged into the blinding gray world he had created. The escape was a paranoid, suffocating journey. The smoke burned his lungs and stung his eyes. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The world was reduced to a gray, silent, claustrophobic bubble. He didn't know if he was being followed, if the host was reestablishing its sight, if a pair of silent eyes was waiting for him just beyond the edge of the smoke. He just ran, fueled by adrenaline and terror, his only guide the compass in his hand and the faint downward slope of the mountain. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of ice through his veins. He had traded the prison of observation for a prison of blindness, and he wasn't sure which was worse. He ran for hours, long after he had left the smoke cloud behind. He didn't stop until he stumbled, ragged and exhausted, out of the forest and onto the gravel Park Service road. He smelled of soot and fear. He flagged down the first vehicle he saw, a park ranger's truck. He told his story, to Sarah, to the park authorities, to anyone who would listen. He played them the recordings of the triangulating calls. He showed them the footage of the animals staring into his cameras. They saw a man who was disheveled, sleep-deprived, and rambling. They investigated the fire, which was eventually blamed on his negligence with a campfire. His incredible story of a coordinated, intelligent animal attack was officially dismissed as a delusion, a psychological break brought on by prolonged isolation and the disorienting effects of the smoke from the fire he himself had started. He had no proof that could not be explained away by science or skepticism, only his haunting story and his own shattered nerves. Months later, Jake was back in the city, but the city was no longer a comfort. He lived in a small apartment, the curtains always drawn. His career as a wildlife photographer was over. He couldn't bear to be in the wild, and he couldn't look at any animal, not even a city pigeon or a stray cat, without searching its eyes for that flicker of alien intelligence, that unnerving, evaluative stare. He was finally developing the last roll of film he'd managed to salvage from the trip, the images he took before the siege began. Most were landscapes, majestic, beautiful, and now, to his eyes, deeply menacing. He came to the final photograph on the roll. It was a shot he'd taken from a high ridge on the third day, a panoramic view of the entire Bighorn Basin. He scanned the image on his computer, the memory of its pristine beauty now tainted with horror. Then he zoomed in, focusing on the small alpine lake that sat like a mirror in the center of the valley. He zoomed in further, the pixels resolving into a clearer image. In the still, perfect reflection on the water surface, barely visible but undeniably there, was the faint, distorted shape of the cabin. And surrounding it on all sides, in the reflection of the trees, on the rocks, along the shoreline, were 1,000 tiny pairs of watching eyes. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.